Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Greetings to the people on the Outreach Ministry and the people on Skype today. Shema Israel, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, v'yahavto et Yahweh Elohecha, b'kol avavecha, uv'kol nafeshecha, uv'kol ma'odecha. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is your Elohim. Yahweh is one, and you shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your resources. And today we're going to talk about a subject that should not be dealt with or should not be thought about frivolously. You know, this is a very serious and a very important subject. We're going to talk about the ordinances of the Passover. And you know, it's not a subject to be approached as just, well, that's just one of the things that we do. Paul said that it was possible to, in 1 Corinthians 11, take the Passover unworthily. And I believe that we can talk about that further later on. That's not the brunt of what I want to talk about today, but I believe that by taking the Passover lightly and not understanding what we're doing could constitute taking the Passover unworthily. You know, what would have happened if Israel had not paid close attention to what Yahweh said, which is what we're going to talk about in Exodus chapter 12 today, and had left out part of the details of what Yahweh told them to do. You know, some of us might not be here. Some of them wouldn't have gone out of Egypt. Many of them. Well, when we're talking about the ordinances of the Passover, did Yahweh give specific instructions on how Israel was to conduct the Passover? Does the Torah of Yahweh give any instructions on changing the ordinances of the Passover? These are questions that people have about Passover. Is the Scripture plain about how the Passover is to be conducted today? What is the Passover anyway? Is it a meal? Is it a sacrifice? Is it communion? Is it a day? Do you keep the Passover or do you take the Passover? We hear both of those terms used, right? Going to keep the Passover, or are you going to take the Passover? Is it on the 14th of the first month or the 15th? These are all questions that people have, and we'll see some other questions as we go along. Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23 gives a pretty clear and concise catalog of the appointed times of Yahweh. It states quite emphatically that they are the appointments of Yahweh, not the appointments of the Jews or any other people exclusively. Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 2. Let's just read it. Leviticus 23 and verse 2. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them the appointed times of Yahweh. True, it is being spoken to Israel, but Yahweh doesn't say their appointed times. He says the appointed times of Yahweh, which you are to proclaim as set-apart gatherings. My appointed times are these. So they're the appointed times of Yahweh. He says they are my appointed times. And that's, of course, quoting from the ISR scriptures. The word appointed times in the Hebrew is moedi, which is the plural possessive of moed. Moedim is the common possessive, but moedi means my appointed times. Okay? And that's what Yahweh said. He used the plural possessive. And there are how many? You can look at your notes and you can cheat a little. There are 9. In previous life, some of us were taught that there were 7. But let's look at it. We have the Shabbat in the very next verse, verse 3. That's the first appointed time. Then in verse 5, we have the Passover. It's an appointed time. Now, granted, it nowhere says that this appointed time is a Shabbat. It's not a day of rest and worklessness. Okay? But it is an appointed time, nevertheless. In verse 6 through 8, verses 6 through 8, we have the days of unleavens or unleavened bread. In verses 10 through 15, we have the day of the Omer count. That's a separate day, and it's in the list where Yahweh says, these are my appointments. And if you don't keep that appointment, you don't know when the next day in the appointments is, Shavuot or Pentecost, because you have to count from that day. So, number 5 is the Feast of Weeks or Shavuot, which is in verses 16 to 22. And then the 6th one is the Day of Blowing, and that's really what the Hebrew says, which we have always called the Feast of Trumpets, but it is Yom, the day of blowing, teruah, or of making a loud noise. And of course, one of the things we use to make a noise on that day is the trumpet. And it's what the Israelites use, the shofar. And that's in verse 24. Number 7 is the Day of Coverings, or in Hebrew it's Kippurim, or we call it Atonement, and that's in verses 27 to 32. That's number 7. And number 8 is the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot, or Tabernacles, from verses 34 to 36. And number 9 is what we call the last day, great day. In the Hebrew, it's Shemini Atzeret. It means the day of great conclusions. And so, there's a definite concluding meaning to that. Now, many of these appointments, and if you read this carefully, I don't think you'll find any other appointments of Yahweh, but there are these 9 appointments. And many of these appointments are designated as days of rest, Shabbat. They are Shabbat. And they are rehearsals, or Kodesh, set apart, Mikra, set apart assemblies, or rehearsals. So they have meaning. They have some definite meaning, and many of those things we have covered in previous messages. Today, I want to concentrate only on this appointment of Passover, because we're rapidly approaching that day, and we want the people in the outreach ministry to be able to reach or to be able to study this, make this study, go through this, and understand it before this Passover day comes, because I think it's essential that we understand it. Now, when Scripture lists the Passover as an appointment of Yahweh, it tells us that the time of keeping the Passover is important. The Passover is different from most of the appointments. It's listed among the appointments, Moedim, but it is nowhere designated as a Shabbat. Now, if you were to go online today, which most of you are able to do, and if you were to type in the Passover, you would get a lot of different websites that talk about the Passover. And if you pick one that's Jewish, you will find that they say the Passover is from the 14th to the 22nd of April. Now you can look at your calendars. Well, I don't think those individual calendars that you have in front of you, unless you have one that you've written the days in, you'll find they're a little bit different. You'll find they're a little different than what we're going to observe, but you'll notice if you count 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, how many days is that? If you count the 14th. It's 9. It's 9 days. Now they will explain that, and they call it, what do you think they call it on their website? That whole 9 days they call the Passover. Okay? Now that's important for us to realize. It's a fact that cannot escape you, and it's been like that for hundreds of years, that they've called this entire, and maybe you could even say a few thousand years, that they have called this festival 8 days. Actually, it's 8 days, because they do explain that it starts at sunset on the first day. So you really don't count that 14th, because they're saying, well, it starts when the 14th ends. So they really have 8 days. And they have 8 days of, they call it Passover. All right? Now, it's true that the spring festival is 8 days. But if you read Leviticus 23, the 8 days are not called Passover. There's only one event that takes place, or one ceremony, or one appointment that takes place that's called the Passover. Then it's followed by a 7-day festival of unleavened bread. Just reverse of, in the fall, when you finish the festivals, you have 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles and a 1-day festival called the Last Great Day, or Shemini Atzeret, but it's still, when you take it together, it's a festival of 8 days, isn't it? But it's really 2 festivals. So it's interesting that those are mirror images in exactly the opposite direction. So that's cool. All right. So the important thing is, when it says in Leviticus 23 that the Passover is on the 14th, it makes it very plain. Yahweh's days start at sunset and end at sunset. Sunset is the beginning and the ending of a day. Okay? And that's important for us to realize. And he makes it very plain that the Passover is at sunset after the 13th going into the 14th. So it's at the beginning of the day. All right? So we're going to read, we're going to read this. It's very important for everybody to understand that. And there are people who get all confused, and because it is an 8-day festival, and they get confused by the Jewish terminology of the 8 days of the Passover. And if you realize that what the Jews are talking about is Passover and days of unleavened bread, then you have 8 days of unleavened bread. That's all confusing, unless you take the time to realize what Yahweh is doing with these appointments. Okay. So, what is this Passover then? And was it ever given to the priests? That's a question that people come up with. It was an observance to be kept at home. It was never given to the priests by Torah. It was relegated to the priests, which I'm not sure that we're going to go into that today, in Kings and Chronicles, by kings who discovered the scroll that talked about the Passover, and the people didn't know, they hadn't kept it for years, they didn't know what to do, so the king took it upon himself, and actually, if you read it carefully, what he was doing was following Numbers chapter 9 for the second Passover. It wasn't even the first Passover, but because they were totally ignorant about how to do it, he had the priests kill the lambs, or the say. And that's not Torah. That's history. It's important history, but it does not change Torah. Anybody think it changes Torah when you read something in the book of Kings and Chronicles? It does not change Torah. Okay. Now, let's start with the instructions that Yahweh gave to Israel for observing the first Passover. And let's go to Exodus chapter 12. That's where we're going to see it. Exodus chapter 12. If you have questions as we go along, if I don't give you a place to ask it, save it, and you can ask it at the end. Maybe your questions will be answered in the message. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 3. We just went through this in the Torah, the weekly Torah, and we went through all of the plagues that Yahweh was going to bring on Egypt, and did, right? And up to this point, there were 9. And this is the 10th one. And this is how Yahweh sets it up. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th day of this month, the one that he designated as the first month, not on about the 10th day, not on, well, depending on how you're going to figure your calendar, right? On the 10th day, there was a specific day. Each one of them is to take for himself a lamb. If you have a King James Version, you probably have a little number by that lamb. I didn't realize that almost every King James has that in there. They have a little number, and if you go to the margin, it says, or kid. And that's the only clue that you have as to what kind of an animal this is, other than just a little white lamb. Because whenever you come to lamb after that, it doesn't have that. And yet it's the same Hebrew word, say. Say. But if you look up say in Hebrew, you'll find that it is an animal of the sheep or the goats, an animal of the flock. And so Yahweh makes it very plain in a verse that we're going to come to that it can be of the sheep or of the goats. Nobody that I know of calls a baby goat a lamb. But for the terminology that's in Exodus chapter 11, it could be. And the King James recognizes it because it has that little footnote there, or marginal reference, and says, or kid. Because the Hebrew word is say, which is not the same word as tzon, lamb. Okay? It can be either. And we don't think about that generally. Okay, so it's a lamb or a kid, and I'm going to read it that way because it is a say. Each one is to take for himself a say, or a lamb or a kid, according to the house of his father, a say for a household, or a lamb or a kid. And if the household is too small for the lamb or the kid, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the beings. According to each man's need, you make your count for the lamb or the kid. Let the lamb or the kid be a perfect one, a year-old male. Take it from, and here it is, take it from the sheep or the goats. And if we're locked into that word lamb there, it doesn't fit very well because you know you don't get a lamb from the goats, right? Okay, so that should be pretty plain, and it's not difficult. It's just, stepping out of your Western thinking a little bit. Okay, so you take it on the 10th day. You decide how many people are going to consume this lamb or kid, and you might get together with some other households around you. Notice there's no instruction. Actually, at this particular time, there's no Levitical priesthood even. So somebody might look at that and say, well, but then when the Levitical priesthood came along, they took it over. But you can't find that anywhere. You do not find that anywhere. When we read Numbers 9 about the second Passover, this is the only appointment, by the way, that Yahweh makes provision for a month later. The only one. And when he does that, he says nothing about taking it to the priest. And there was a Levitical priesthood then. Okay? You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Okay, if you keep it until the 14th day, all right? So if you look at your calendar, for this year, it's going to occur on the first day of the week, the 14th day. If you keep it until, when does that 14th day start? At sundown the day before. So there is until the 14th day at sundown the day before. Because when the sundown occurs on the 13th, you are into the 14th. That's until. Everybody clear on that? That's not difficult, is it? Okay. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then all the assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the evenings. All right, this is the Hebrew term, Bein Ha'arbaim. Bein Ha'arbaim. And it means twilight, dusk. From the time the sun goes down until totally dark. Now, you have to kill it in that particular period of time. We kind of watch, and as soon as it's sundown, we kill it. All right? But we could kill it, and we don't have a big window. You know, there are some parts of the country where they have a lot bigger window. And we were noticing that the other night. Lou and I were doing some work out here, and he says, well, I'll work until dark. Well, 5 minutes after the sun goes down, it's dark. We have almost no dusk here. But I remember in Minnesota, well, the sun would go down, and we'd have an hour of dusk. Almost a whole hour of twilight. And that's what we called it, dusk or twilight. And that's what Bein Ha'arbaim means. And so it's different in different parts of the world how long that Bein Ha'arbaim is. But even 5 minutes is long enough to kill it. So, you know, there's nobody that can't kill it, Bein Ha'arbaim. Say what? Well, you do your part, and if it takes a little longer for it to die, and if you do the cutting right, Jeff, it'll die pretty quickly. Right. Okay. So now we're still talking about, but you notice how important that Bein Ha'arbaim is. So here's the timing of the Passover. After the sunset, when you keep that lamb or kid up to the 14th day, and then when the sun goes down and you enter Bein Ha'arbaim, that's when you kill it. It's not a day later. It's not a day earlier. It's very specific. It's very concise. Now, we are talking about the first Passover here, and when we look at ordinances later on, we'll say, well, did that change? Has Yahweh ever changed that? That you kill the lamb or the kid, Bein Ha'arbaim. Okay, so that's what we've got. All right. Now, let's see if I need to go any further in there. Yes, okay. Then all the assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the evenings, Bein Ha'arbaim, and they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat. Okay? Now, some people have the question, why don't we put the blood on the doorpost? All right? Keep that, just kind of hold that question in there, because we're going to answer that. In verse 8, and they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread. Now, when we go to the New Testament, and Yeshua uses the bread as a symbol of his body, is he adding to the Passover? Well, unleavened bread is not adding to the Passover. All right? They shall eat flesh roasted in fire with unleavened bread, with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head and its legs and its inward parts. That doesn't mean you eat the head or the inward parts. It just means they're going to be disposed of on the same fire. Do not leave of it until morning. And what does remain of it until morning, you are to burn with fire. And this is how you eat it. This is how you eat it. Your loins girded. Anybody here ever eaten Passover without their loins girded? You know, whatever that means. And I think it means you got to be dressed. Now they had their traveling clothes on. Okay, so some people look at that and say, well, you got to put on your tunic. Your sandals on your feet. Well, we don't wear sandals. But most people who come, I mean, I don't know of anybody who takes off their shoes and socks except for the foot washing at the Passover. Does he? Well, you better keep your shoes on. No, we'll see. Does that still apply? In other words, and your staff in your hand. So, in other words, they were ready to go, right? And I mean, we properly understand that, and that's true. That's what it is. And you shall eat it in haste. Eat it in haste. It is the Passover of Yahweh. Do you get that? What you eat is it, and what you eat is the it that is the Passover. That's pretty plain, isn't it? But I don't know why people miss that, but that's what it says. What you eat is the Passover. Okay, now there's some other things that are connected with it. It is the Passover of Yahweh. All right? So then Yahweh tells Moses what he is going to do in Exodus 12:12. And I shall pass through the land of Mitzrayim on that night, and shall smite all the firstborn in the land of Mitzrayim, both man and beast, and on all the mighty ones of Mitzrayim I shall execute judgment. I am Yahweh. And the blood that you've put on your doorpost shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I shall pass over, avar, you, and let the plague not come on you to destroy you when I smite the land of Mitzrayim. So what is the plague that Yahweh is bringing? Remember, it's the 10th one bringing on Mitzrayim. What is the plague?
Killing the firstborn.
It's pretty plain, isn't it? Killing the firstborn. So, what would have happened if there were places in Israel, if there were houses in Israel where they had not kept the Passover as instructed by Yahweh and had not put the blood on the doorposts? What would have happened in those houses? Their firstborn would have died. It's the plague of the dead. It wouldn't have been everybody in the house. It would have been the firstborn in the house, because that's the plague that Yahweh is bringing on Mitzrayim, and he gave Israel a way out of that plague. Okay? That's not too difficult. The firstborn of every non-observing house would have died. That was the plague. The festival is about the redemption, this passing over of the firstborn or the first fruits. Now, some of us were taught that the Passover was a commemoration of the forgiveness of the sins of the whole world, right? Anybody ever taught that? If you were ever taught anything about Passover, the Passover was for the forgiveness of the sins of the whole world. That's what we were taught. And they read John 1:29, John chapter 1 and verse 29, where on the next day Yochanan saw Yeshua coming toward him, and he said, "See, the Lamb of Elohim who takes away the sin of the world." And so it was the death of Yeshua that took away the sins of the world. Therefore, Passover is about taking away the sins of the world. That's the conclusion that we came to. And yet, that's not scriptural. The whole business about Passover is the redemption of the first fruits or the firstborn. That's all it's about. And for those who think that Yeshua was their Passover to take away the sins of the whole world, Yeshua did not die at the time of the Passover. Surprise! Because he kept, as we will read, the Passover the night before. He kept the Passover and then he died the next day. All right, let's go on. So, the same sacrifice, it is true that the same sacrifice that took place at that Passover in 30 A.D., Yeshua's death, is the death that takes away the sins of the whole world, but it wasn't at the time of the Passover. And yes, Yeshua and his blood are the redemption of the first fruits, but every man in his order, the first fruits, then those who are his that is coming, and then, by the plan of Yahweh, those who are going to have their covering from the Day of Atonement. And it is the Day of Atonement sacrifice, and even the daily sacrifice, that picture the death of Yeshua for the sins of the whole world. But how many times could he die? He could only die once. I mean, I guess Yahweh could have been, you know, what would we think of that if Yahweh had Yeshua die at Passover and then resurrected him and not give him what we would call an esteemed body at the time of his first resurrection, and then made him go right back into the flesh again and come back during the fall festival at the Day of Atonement and die again. Go through all that business all over again. Now, some people would only understand it if Yahweh had done it that way. But that's not the way he did it. And he does give us a clue at the Passover of the blood shed for the sins of the whole world. And so, in that sense, he makes a bridge to Passover. But it was the two goats, and they were goats, by the way. So I'm pretty sure that probably when Yochanan in John 1:29 said, "Behold the Lamb of Yahweh," I'm pretty sure that he probably said, "Behold the say." Behold the say of Yahweh. Because it was definitely kids that were sacrificed for the sins of the whole world on Yom Kippurim. Okay, so he couldn't die for each of those. You know, for the daily, he couldn't die at the time of he did die at the time of the daily sacrifice, by the way, one of them. But he didn't die at the time of atonement. He didn't even die at the time of Passover. And yet, most of Christianity believes he died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because that's when the priests were sacrificing the Passover. Oh, the priests were making sacrifices, all right, and they may have called it Passover because it was within this whole 8-day period they called the Passover, but it wasn't the Passover of Yahweh. It was the Passover of Rabbi Says. And you can read, by the way, I have a commentary over here that will tell you that Bein Ha'arbaim always meant twilight until the rabbis got a hold of it. And the Jewish commentary says that the rabbis changed that so the priests would have time. They changed it to mean from noon till sunset. So the priests would have time to kill all those lambs that they were not even instructed to kill. Rabbi Says. So the Jewish commentary will admit to you that Bein Ha'arbaim means at dusk, at twilight. But the rabbis changed it and moved it to 3 o'clock, or inclusive of 3 o'clock, but from noon till sunset the next day. And that's when the rabbis, moved Passover. But Yeshua kept it the night before, according to Torah. So the people who think that they have to keep Passover at the time, or that Yeshua died at the time the priests were offering Passover, I guess they don't have any atonement for their sins then, because Yeshua did not die at the time of atonement. He didn't even die at the time of Passover, but in their mind he did. Okay, now what part of these instructions is the Passover? We could conclude that only the slaughter animal was the Passover. And we can certainly conclude that that is a very big part of it, can't we? Because it says, you shall eat it. It is the Passover. And so what you eat is the Passover. But one should not stop reading here. The rest of the passage reads, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Mitzrayim, when he smote the Mitzrites and delivered our households. Clearly, the passing over the children of Israel, the redemption of the first fruits, if you will, or of the firstborn, is part of the Passover, the passing over of them, because it's the redemption. And it is the passing over that gives title to the name. If there was no say, there would be no passing over. We pretty much established that. But you don't eat the passing over, do you? You don't eat, that's not what you eat. It's the say that is the memorial of the passing over, and if we could use an old cliche, the reason for the season. Okay? So then he gives instruction to keep a back-to-back festival, the festival of unleavened bread, for 7 days following the Passover. Most important for the moment is the command to keep these festivals as an everlasting law. This festival, the Passover and the days of unleavened bread, have a clear message about redeeming firstfruits. It's the Day of Atonement that has the message about the blood shed for the sins of the whole world. Even though there is blood on the doorposts, the message of the Passover is scripturally the redemption of the first fruits. The blood on the doorpost was going to save no one else. It was going to redeem the firstborn, the first fruits. Now, Yahweh repeats many of the instructions on keeping the Passover from verse 43. So in Exodus 12, let's actually go to verse 42. Start reading in verse 42. It is a night to be observed unto Yahweh for bringing them out of Mitzrayim. Now, so this is where a lot of people think, well, see, the Passover is killed at the end of the 14th and going to the 15th because the 15th is the day they went out. But if the events of the night before, the 14th, the killing of the say, the blood on the doorposts, Yahweh passing over with his death messenger, whoever that was, if that had not occurred, Israel would not have come out of Egypt. True? Can we say true, Dad? True, Dad. So, the thing that sprung Israel was the Passover. That's what caused Pharaoh to decide long enough to let Israel out of the land, out of Mitzrayim. So we, in times past, we have looked at that and we thought, well, that's talking about the night that they went out on the 15th. And so we made another festival of Yahweh and or appointment, and we said it was the night to be much observed. And when you look at the Hebrew closely, in the night to be much observed, it's a night of watchings. And when we go to the New Testament, if you will recall, and we'll read this again and again probably between now and the end of Passover, that Yeshua told his disciples, could you not watch with me 1 hour? So as far as Yeshua was concerned, what was the night of watching? It was the night of Passover. And so that's exactly what he's saying here. It's a night of watchings. The word is shomer. It's the same word that some people use and say, well, you got to watch and you got to observe visually the moon. No, it's shomer. It's guarding or watching. It's a night of watchings, paying attention to. This night is to Yahweh, to be observed by all the children of Israel throughout their generations. And it is talking about the Passover night, because now he goes on and he says, in this context, and Yahweh said to Moses and to Aaron, this is the law, the kukah, which we would translate and understand as the word ordinances. These are the ordinances. Now, we know what ordinances are. If you violate the speed zones down there, you are violating an ordinance. You know, we talk about ordinances all the, lawyers will. Judges will talk about the ordinance. The ordinance is this number. Well, it's the ordinance that we're talking about here. Here are the ordinances of the Passover. Now, he just said, this is the night that you're going to observe throughout your generations, and here are the ordinances for this night. How many of you are going to keep the first Passover? The way Israel kept it. the way Israel was instructed to keep that first Passover. That's not what we're going to keep. We're going to keep the Passover that Yahweh says, this is to be kept throughout your generations, and here are the ordinances. Now, just from our observation, who can tell me some differences between that first Passover that the Israel kept and the one we're going to keep, or the ones that we keep? Brian can. What are some differences? Anybody else before Brian? What's going to be different about when we keep the Passover as opposed to when Israel kept the first Passover? And it's the same thing that's true of when Israel kept the second Passover and every Passover that they kept, which they didn't keep very many. What, Johnny? Yeah, tell me one. Huh? Well, why? Why wouldn't we?
Because we're not waiting for the death angel to pass over.
Yeah, there's going to be no death angel passing over, is there? No. We're keeping this as a memorial of when that death angel did pass over, but the death angel's not going to pass over. I mean, if that were true, if it was passing over every Passover, we'd have a lot of funerals the next day. I don't mean the congregation of Yahweh, but I mean Israel would have a lot of funerals the day after the night before. Okay? So, that's definitely true. And when we read these ordinances, guess what we're going to find? It doesn't say that you put the blood on the doorposts. Would it be wrong to put the blood on the doorposts? No, as a commemoration, but it's not going to mean anything because there's going to be no death angel Passover. Okay, so that's one difference. What else? Okay, it said you couldn't go outside. What did you say, Louise? Yeah, we can leave the premises, but we're going to get that from, and we're going to see that it doesn't say here in the ordinances that you can't go out. It doesn't say that. Because guess why it doesn't say that? Because again, there's going to be no death messenger. What else? What about the staff in your hand and the sandals on your feet? What else are we not going to do? We're not going to leave the country. There's going to be no trip. Well, I don't know, Chris. Would there be a trip? Ooh, if you had your way, there would. Okay, there's no trip. Just kidding. There's no trip. So when we read the ordinances of the Passover, for all generations, it's not going to say with your staff in your hand and your shoes, the sandals on your feet. Anybody think of anything else? Well, let's see. Let's read this. Let's read these ordinances. Yes, James?
Wasn't it at that time, or was it in the morning, where they were supposed to collect all the gold and the silver and everything from the Egyptians?
Oh, we'd like that, wouldn't we? Except there's no Egyptians. That instruction was for that first Passover, right? And we don't see that instruction here because
I can't remember if it was that evening or early in that morning that they were.
it was during the daytime it was during the Passover day that they were when Yahweh said, "Go spoil the Egyptians," right? So they obviously couldn't have been that night because they couldn't go out of their houses.
So instead of the Egyptians, we could go to the Federal Reserve and do the same thing.
Well, I wouldn't advise it. And we're not instructed that way here, okay? All right, let's look at it. Let's look at what the ordinances are for the Passover that is to be kept throughout your generations, and notice those differences. All right? No son of a stranger is to eat of it. So, we don't invite people casually off the street to come and eat this Passover with us. No stranger is to eat of it. But any servant a man has bought with silver or for silver, when you have circumcised him, let him eat of it. Now, I know there's some believers today, so-called believers, who will say, well, if you baptized him, that's good enough. I don't find that anywhere in Scripture. It says, when When you have circumcised him, let him eat of it. Notice again, a sojourner and a hired servant. Now we're reading the Passover for the ages, for all generations. A sojourner and a hired servant does not eat of it. It is eaten in one house. You know, you can still get together. In other words, we're not gonna kill the say, cook it here, and we're not going to carry it. If you decided that I'm going to stay home, say Brian and Johnny, we're going to stay home. We can't. They're going to have to kill their own say. We can't take part of our say over to their house. That's what it means. You don't take this say and divide it up in a bunch of houses. No. Wherever the people are gathered to kill and eat this say, you do it there. But you don't share it with another group somewhere else. No, we got people, Willie and Debbie and the boys out there are going to kill a say out there, and they're going to eat it. So we don't have to worry about trying to air flight some out there to them, because they know to kill their own say. All right? Is that pretty plain what he's talking about here? Okay. Because that's what the scripture says. Because everybody has to experience that killing of the say and preparing that Passover. Teaching. Yeah. It's the instruction of Yahweh. It is eaten in one house. You are not to take any of the flesh outside the place where you have decided to do this ceremony, nor are you to break any bone of it. So you can't go down to the market and just buy a leg of lamb and bring it home and cook it. How many bones did they break? All the congregation of Israel are to perform it. And when a stranger sojourns with you and shall perform the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised. And let them come near and perform it, and he shall be as a native of the land, but let no uncircumcised eat of it. Now that presents a problem for me and Brian, because we don't do pants checks. But we preach this, and we tell you that if you are uncircumcised, you cannot eat the Passover. Okay? Because it's not our instruction. It's Yahweh's. And the Passover is different. It never tells you anywhere for any of the other set-apart days, it never says only uncircumcised, or only circumcised can do it. And you have to be certain. I mean, if you're going to keep the Passover, the assumption is that you're probably going to keep the other ones, and you're not going to go get uncircumcised before the next set-apart day. Okay? But if you're going to be a first fruit, you're going to follow this instruction of Yahweh. These are the instructions for the first fruits, because that's what this day is all about, redemption of the first fruits. So circumcision is pretty important, isn't it? And so we have preached this. We've never asked anybody, are you? But we preach this, and we preach it strong enough so that the people who come in can get this instruction. If their heart is circumcised, they're going to want to do according to the word and the Torah of Yahweh. So we have had 12-year-olds who said, Mom, I gotta do this before the Passover, so I can take the Passover. We've had 85-year-olds. We've had 75-year-olds. We've had everything in between, where people have been convicted by the Ruach of Yahweh and understood that this is an ordinance of the Passover forever. James?
Okay, and I don't mean to throw a curveball in here, but let's go to Paul, and I don't know what section.
Not now. But Paul can Paul change Torah?
No, but what
No.
was he talking about? I'm just asking, what was he talking about with that when he brought
When Paul is talking about circumcision, he is talking about the circumcision. He is talking about a band of rabbinic Judaizers. He is talking about oral law. When Paul says Timothy was not, what is the word? what does he say about Timothy, or not Timothy, Titus was not compelled. When Titus was not compelled to be circumcised, that does not mean he wasn't circumcised. It means he wasn't forced to be. We don't force anybody, but we do preach that they should not take the Passover if they're uncircumcised.
That's what I'm talking about. Because Peter and everybody else is saying these people, and I don't know if it was the Corinthians, the Romans, or whatever that part was, and Peter was saying, no, there was an argument there about that to bring them in.
Right. Acts chapter 15. In Acts chapter 15, it says, when people are just coming to the congregation, you don't require the circumcision of them. But there was a ban that said they couldn't even come to the temple if they weren't circumcised. Okay? In Acts 15, it says, these are the things. Things sacrificed, blood, idolatry, those things. It doesn't mention circumcision, but it does say, because when they come to Sabbath services, this is what they'll hear. They'll hear Torah preached, and then they will decide to keep Torah. You don't require it for them to hear Torah, but when they hear Torah, if Yahweh is working on their heart, they will do it. That's what the whole issue is in the New Testament. Okay? So these are the ordinances of the Passover. They have never changed. Never changed. All right. So this is the law. Perform it. Don't take any outside. Now, do you see anything here about having the staff in your hand? He says in verse 49, there's one Torah for the native born and for the stranger who sojourns among you. And all the children of Israel did so as Yahweh commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And so they were supposed to do throughout their generations, and they didn't. But here we are called to it today. We have come to the synagogue of Yahweh, if you will. We have been taught the Torah of Yahweh, and so we presume that when we come and hear the Torah of Yahweh, our hearts are pricked and we're going to do according to the Torah of Yahweh. All right? Now, in this, the ordinances from verse 43 to 49, do we see blood on the doorposts? No, we don't. If all we have in the New Testament, which I don't know if we're going to get time to go there today or not, but when Yeshua kept the Passover, his disciples said, "Where shall we go to prepare the Passover for you?" Well, we know what the Passover is, right? It's what you eat. So they were asking, where are we going to go and prepare this say for you? Right? There's no mention in there. It does say they prepared the Passover, and of course they only had the Torah of Yahweh. But do you think they could have differentiated between the ordinances of the first Passover and the ordinances that Yahweh said are for all generations, the Passover that you keep for all generations? I mean, nobody pointed that out to me. I just read the scripture and Yahweh revealed it to me. I mean, is it hard to understand that? Do you have to have somebody who shows you the difference in what happened with the first Passover and what happened with the Passover that he says is for all generations? I think the scriptures are plain. So it doesn't say exactly what they did. Would it have been wrong for them to put the blood on the doorpost? No, but would it have prevented anything? No. Actually, it would have drawn more attention to them, wouldn't it? So I'm not saying whether they put the blood on the doorposts or whether they didn't. I am saying from reading these scriptures, it is not in the ordinances that Yahweh says are forever. Okay? Now they did some other things. They definitely went out that night, because that night they went out to the Mount of Olives. So they didn't keep that part of the ordinances that were for the first Passover, that you don't go out of your house, did they? No. So there are some plain and clear differences between that first Passover and Passovers that are for all generations as a memorial of that first Passover. Okay. Now let's see. So, now the term Passover came to be understood, as I mentioned, in Hebrew circles as the Passover day plus the 7 days of unleavened bread, which you can prove to yourself by going online and looking up the Passover. You can see that. This is the understanding that can be ciphered from Deuteronomy 16, which we'll go there real quickly. Deuteronomy 16, because a lot of people will read this, and it says, you shall not kill the Passover just anywhere, but where Yahweh chooses to place his name. By the time that Deuteronomy 16 is written or edited, whatever was done here, it was already understood that Passover was the whole 8-day festival. And you can prove that by looking at the sacrifices that it prescribes for the Passover in verse 2. You shall slaughter the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim from the flock and the herd. Does anybody not know the difference between a flock and a herd? We have a little bit of, that muddied up in our brains because we're Western thinkers. But if you're a Hebrew, a flock is small cattle. A herd is large cattle. Small cattle are like sheep and goats. And they come, when they're in a group, they're called a flock. When you have cows, buffalo, big animals like that, you call a group of them a herd. A difference between flocks and herds, between sheep and goats and larger cattle, cows. And you notice that this Passover can be taken from the flock and the herd. Did Torah ever say you could take Passover, the Passover that we've been talking about, from a cow? It has to be a sheep or a goat, a lamb or a kid. They are of the flock, not the herd. Now, if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 28, and if you read the sacrifices for the days of unleavened bread, you find that it can be from, and some of them are from the flock, and some of them are from the herd. You have bullocks being sacrificed. So this terminology that here is talking about the Passover is talking about the Passover in the greater sense of the 8 days. It's very easy if you just think about that's exactly what has come to pass. All right. So the ordinances of the Passover only include an animal from the flock in the household. The portion of the Passover festival commanded to be Kodesh Mikra were the days of unleavened bread, along with the sacrifices from the flocks and the herds, Numbers 28, 17 to 25. You read that yourself, and if you have questions about it, please come and ask sometime between now and Passover, because get this straight in your head. This is a very important festival if you are going to fulfill what the meaning of this day is. Some believe Deuteronomy 16 constitutes a change in keeping the Passover, relegating the sacrifices to the Levitical priesthood. Such a change is nowhere authorized in Yahweh's instruction. Further, the fact that Israel did have priests sacrificing the Passover at a later date is shown in Ezra 6, 19 through 20, and 2 Chronicles 30, 15, 21, 23, which was, by the way, a Passover of the second month, does not prove a change in the Torah ordinances. There were special circumstances, which I mentioned earlier. A nation coming out of exile who had not been keeping the Passover at all and were not accustomed to the practices, and a nation that had gotten so far away from the teachings of Yahweh that they were surprised by what the book had to say and were not ready to keep it according to the word of Yahweh. In fact, they had to do it the second month. In both cases, the people were so lax as to have relegated even their own duties to the priesthood, who would do it for them. Clearly, when we find Yeshua and his disciples preparing to keep the Passover, we find something far more in line with the Torah ordinances. In Matthew chapter 26, and verse 17. On the first day of unleavened bread, the taught ones came to Yeshua. Well, obviously, we just went over that on Wednesday night. That is not what this scripture means. It doesn't mean on the first, and even the word day is in italics. It's as they were coming to the beginning of the days of unleavened bread. Yeshua's disciples asked him, "Where do you wish us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" How can you eat the Passover without eating the say? You can't. And he said, did he tell them, go and talk to the priests and make sure that they will save aside a lamb for me? No. He says, go into the city to a certain man, say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am to observe Passover at your house with my taught ones. That is Torah. Keeping it at a private house where the disciples prepare the Passover and everything that entailed with getting the Passover in a condition where you could eat it, because that's what they were going to do. So, first of all, it was not the first day of unleavened bread. It was toward the beginning or at the approach of the days of unleavened bread. Many Hebraisms are lost in the translation, by the way. Next, notice that Yeshua did not send his disciples to the temple to inquire of the priests. He sent them to a private individual where they would prepare the Passover at his house. So Yeshua affirms that the private keeping of the Passover, as called for by the ordinances of the Torah that we just went over, was not changed as far as he was concerned. So what would Yeshua do today if he were here? He would do what he did then. If you had been a disciple of Yeshua then and were given these instructions, what part of Scripture would you be following to fulfill his request? Exodus 12:43 and following, right? Most assuredly, an animal slaughtered to be eaten in a private home by covenant people. And Yeshua's disciples ate the Passover with Yeshua. Okay? Now, would Yeshua have kept it at the right time? Everyone I've ever talked to readily admits that Yeshua kept his last Passover at the beginning of the 14th of Aviv. This is the only way to keep the Passover. All of the ordinances with the full meaning of the Passover occurring on one of the scriptural days as stated in Leviticus 23:5, in the first month on the 14th of the month between the evenings is the Passover to Yahweh. And Yeshua was impaled about 12 o'clock and died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was Passover day, but the time for keeping the Passover, Bein Ha'arbaim, was already way past. Way past. Bein Ha'arbaim, or between the evenings, is a sticking point for some. They believe that this phrase in the Hebrew means after 3 o'clock. I've already explained to you that you can check out the Jewish commentary and it will plainly show you that the Hebrew understanding of this term is twilight, and the rabbis changed it. When you take all of the Passover instructions and actions as a broader picture, you can see that the Passover in its entirety took place on the same day, the 14th, the same time Yeshua and his disciples kept it. The Israelites in Egypt began preparing the Passover at dusk, and that is precisely when Yeshua's disciples began. They had the say, and during the course of the meal, they partook of the bread and the wine. The bread was prescribed as a part of the Passover. Eat unleavened bread with the say, and the wine as a symbol that was put on the blood was put on the doorposts. They weren't, I don't believe, putting the blood on the doorposts. And I think the reason that Yeshua takes the wine is in place of the blood on the doorpost because they weren't doing it. At about midnight in Egypt, the death messenger came by, and in Yeshua's time, about midnight, the crowd came to the garden where Yeshua was. Yeshua and his disciples went out. Passover night in Jerusalem at the time of Yeshua was a parallel to the Passover night in Egypt. It had to be, for it was a shadow of things to come. Yahweh is consistent. Malachi 3:6. I change not, he says. When Yeshua said on the stake that he had finished the work the Father gave him to do just before he died, what was he referring to? What was he referring to? John 17:4. I have esteemed you on the earth, and having accomplished the work you have given me that I should do. Well, the work included living a perfect life, so that he could be the sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. But what he did on that day was the work of the redemption of the first fruits, pictured by the Passover, the days of unleavened bread, and the first fruit harvest of Pentecost, or Shavuot. The call for Yah's servants to watch for events leading up to his second coming, pictured by the Feast of Trumpets. The forgiveness, he's accomplishing all of this. This is his work. The forgiveness of the sins of the whole world, pictured by the Day of Atonement and the sin offerings. The establishing of his qualifications as the rightful ruler of Yahweh's kingdom, pictured by the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot. And the setting up and the reaffirming of the standards of judgment for the future white throne judgment, pictured by the last great day. All of that was accomplished at the death of Yeshua. And the first thing that he accomplished was the redemption of the first fruits, of the firstborn. So that's what the ordinances of the Passover are. That's the ordinances of the Passover for all generations in the context of Exodus chapter 12. And it's what we will be doing in about 6 more weeks. I didn't count the days. Now, are there any questions? Yes.
Can you spell that word about twilight?
Bain, it's, okay. I have, you mean in the Hebrew?
Well, I see it in Hebrew, but I mean a Hebrew
Transliteration?
Yeah.
I thought I had the transliteration in the notes. Bain, B-E-Y-N, Ha, H-A, Arbaim, A-R-B-A-Y-I-M. That is a transliteration of the Hebrew Bain Ha'arbaim.
Okay, you look at that. B-E-B-A-Y.
B-E-Y-N, Bain, or, I mean, you could say B-A-N-E, because we would pronounce that Bain.
Okay.
You can transliterate in a lot of different ways. Ha is the word the. Bain is between. Ha is the. Arbaim, or Aravim, is evenings, between the evenings.
And that's R-A.
A-R-B or V. I-M. Mm-hmm. B-A-R-B-A-Y-I-M.
Okay.
B-A-Y-R.
Um,
B-A-R-Y.
I asked
I-M.
the question because I wanted to just kind of get that. Now, when Yeshua arrives 3 days later, or 3 days after he was in the grave,
Right.
is that the time period that he was in that they talk about when he arose from, kind of
Okay.
in the grave?
He died at 3 o'clock on Wednesday. He was put in the tomb about sunset on Wednesday. He was in the grave Wednesday night to Thursday night to Friday sunset, Friday night to about sunset on Shabbat.
And that's what I'm talking about. You were talking about it's that time period between the sunset, that 0 period between the sunset.
Sunset and dark is
Right.
Bain Ha'arbaim.
Is that, could that be the period that he arose in?
Yes, very, very, very well could have been. When they went to the tomb at the beginning of the first day of the week, it says dawn in the King James, but it really means at the beginning of the day, which is really that Bain Ha'arbaim. He was already gone. He was risen.
Right. When you said that.
Because so he was in the, so,
To me was that arisen period, because all the texts want to throw that in the evening on the first day, or the first day of the light. Everybody, all the gospels have got that in there.
Mhm.
I've always thought, no, it's in that period between this and this. right here.
Yeah, well, it says he was 3 days and 3 nights, so if he was put in the tomb, if he was dead at 3 o'clock, I don't know how long it took him to get him to the tomb, but say he went in the tomb at 5 o'clock on Wednesday.
Right.
3 days and 3 nights later would be about 5 o'clock on the Sabbath. And they weren't going to come. What was the reason they were coming to the tomb? Well, because they hadn't anointed, they hadn't put the spices on his body. And when they came to do that, as soon as they could, which was after sundown on the Sabbath, because they weren't going to do that, according to Torah, on the Sabbath day. They were going to wait until Sabbath was over. When they came to do it immediately after Sabbath is over, he's already risen. Right. So 3 days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, those are the 3 days, and the nights preceded them. Thursday night, Friday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, and Friday night.
And the question would be, he did not arise on a Sabbath, right?
He healed on the Sabbath. He could have.
Okay.
I don't see any problem with him being resurrected on before sundown on Sabbath.
How would it have to be raised on the Sabbath if it was going to be an accurate 3 days and 3 nights, because he had to go he had to be taken down before the Sabbath began.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And just one other thing. They talked about this,
It had to be 3 days and 3 nights, because he said that was the only sign that he was the Savior. Same sign as Jonah, right?
and there was a part here, it says, first of all, it was, the part where the top was asked Yeshua, it says, and on the first day of unleavened bread.
Yeah.
Okay, it's already the unleavened bread, and they're asking about going.
Yeah, that doesn't make it, that's not how that should read. That's a mistranslation. And it's a misunderstanding from Hebrew to Greek to English. Yeah.
Well, even in the ISR, and I got the English Standard Version, all of them have got that.
Yeah.
And it's like, hold it,
Why didn't somebody get this right?
yeah.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's obvious. It's so obvious that maybe I haven't talked to the people who translated the ISR to find out. Well, why couldn't you get that right? I mean, I tried to get the Hallelujah people to fix something. What was that?
Ashrod.
Was it Ashrai? I thought there was something like that had to do with Shavuot too. That's what it was. Sabbaton. Yeah. And they, of course, those I could understand. Those people we actually did talk to, and they were adamant that the Ruach had inspired them, and they weren't going to change it. So I think they just didn't want to, acknowledge it, because it would have been a big expense to reprint the book. But anyway, I have not talked to any ISR people, so I don't know why they couldn't get that right. It's so plain and obvious that it couldn't have been. Even the way the Jews were doing it, they were doing it later, not before, just like they are now. I mean, when they come along to Passover, the first day of Passover is the 14th, which really means it's the 15th of April, and they've already had a postponement. Even by their own standards, they postpone, and so their Passover is the 15th through the 22nd. So their Passover day is the 15th. The way we look at it is the 13th.
It's just one of those things.
Not the 13th day of the first month, but the 13th of April. It just happens to be very close to the.
It's one of those things you read forever and ever and ever, and just
Absolutely.
realize.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Really, it's like, hold it, we're talking about Passover, and
Passover never comes before the days of unleavened bread. And you notice that day is in italics. Even in the ISR scriptures, day is in italics. So the first of unleavened bread, not the first day. And first can mean other than, day one. It can mean as it's approaching the beginning of, and that's what I put in the notes there. It really should say toward the beginning of the days of unleavened bread. Because Passover is kept, and then you have the days of unleavened bread. So Passover is toward the beginning of the days of unleavened bread. Anybody out there on Skype have a question? Is it, if you have questions after we hang up or after, yes, Ronnie?
In Leviticus, verse 27, chapter 23, on the 10th day of the 7th month, the day of atonement, it shall be 7 o'clock out of you, and you shall afflict your being.
Means you fast. The quickest way for you to fast is to afflict yourself. To afflict yourself is to fast. The quickest way to afflict yourself is to fast. And the Jews have always observed it as a fast day. And it says there that you fast from the 9th day at even. So you have an even at the end of the 9th day, because the Day of Atonement is the 10th day. So as soon as sun sets on the 9th day, you begin to afflict your being. You don't have to record anymore.
Oh, I hear you ended, son.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't do the Yiva Rekeka Yahweh Vaishmareka. Ya'er Yahweh Panavaleka Vikaneka Yasa Yahweh Panavaleka V'yasem Laka Shalom. Okay, but we'll still take questions though.